Thomas had been living by himself on the old family farm for 15 long years. Every morning he would wake up at exactly 5:30 when the rooster crowed from the yard outside his bedroom window. The same routine, day after day, year after year. He would pull on his worn boots, splash cold water on his face, and head out to check on the animals before the sun came up. The farm wasn't big, but it was all his now. His parents had left it to him when they passed away in a car accident when he was just 25 years old. Back then, he thought he might sell the place and move to the city like most young people did. But somehow, he never could bring himself to leave. Maybe it was because he could still hear his father's voice telling him how to fix the fence posts, or his mother humming while she fed the chickens every evening. Now at 40, Thomas looked older than his years. His brown hair had started going gray at the temples, and deep lines had formed around his eyes from squinting in the sun all day. His hands were rough and calloused from years of hard work, but they were gentle when he handled the animals. The cows knew his voice, and the old barn cat would wind around his legs every morning, waiting for scraps from breakfast. People in town thought he was strange. When he drove his old pickup truck into Miller's Creek for supplies every 2 weeks, folks would nod politely but keep their conversations short. The store clerk would ring up his groceries without much chatter. The gas station attendant would fill his tank and take his money with just a "have a good day." Thomas had gotten used to it. He told himself he preferred the quiet anyway, but sometimes late at night when the house creaked and settled around him, he would wonder what it might be like to hear another person moving around in the rooms, to have someone to talk to about whether the corn was growing well this year, or if that storm brewing on the horizon looked serious. He would quickly push those thoughts away, though. He had his routine, his animals, his books. That was enough. The farmhouse itself showed signs of a man living alone. Dishes would pile up in the sink for days until he finally washed them all at once. Laundry would hang on the line until it was almost stiff before he remembered to bring it in. The rooms that he didn't use regularly had started to smell musty and closed off. His bedroom, the kitchen, and the front room where he kept his father's old armchair were the only spaces that felt truly lived in. Thomas read a lot in the evenings. He had boxes of books that his mother had collected over the years, and he would work his way through them slowly, reading by the light of the old lamp next to his father's chair. He read about faraway places and different kinds of people, but it all felt like stories from another world. His world was bounded by the fence lines of his property and the familiar roads that led to town and back. The traveling salesmen who sometimes stopped by were his main source of news from the outside world. They would tell him about new farming equipment or changes in crop prices, and sometimes they would share gossip from other farms in the area. Thomas would listen politely and offer them coffee, grateful for the brief interruption in his solitude. But he never encouraged them to stay long. His closest neighbors, the Hendersons, lived about 2 miles down the road. They were kind enough people, but they had their own busy lives with 3 young children and a dairy operation that kept them working from dawn to dusk. Sometimes Mrs. Henderson would wave when she drove past his mailbox, and Mr. Henderson would stop to chat if they met at the feed store in town. But they had never been the type to drop by for casual visits. Thomas had tried dating a few times in his 20s, but it had never worked out. The women he met seemed to want things he didn't know how to give them. They wanted to go dancing or to restaurants in the bigger towns nearby. They wanted romantic gestures and sweet words that felt foreign in his mouth. After a few awkward attempts, he had simply stopped trying. It was easier to focus on the farm, on things he understood and could control. The seasons marked time for him now. Spring meant planting and new calves being born. Summer was long days in the fields and hoping for enough rain, but not too much. Fall brought harvest time and the satisfaction of another year's work completed. Winter was for mending equipment and planning for the next year. It was a simple cycle, predictable and safe. His morning routine never varied. After checking the animals, he would come back to the house and make coffee in the same blue pot his mother had used. He would scramble eggs from his own chickens and eat them standing up at the kitchen counter while looking out the window at his fields. Then it was back outside for whatever work the day required. Evenings were the hardest time. When the work was done and the animals were settled for the night, the silence of the house would press in around him. He would heat up something simple. For dinner, maybe beans and cornbread or soup from a can. He ate most of his meals standing up or sitting on the front porch when the weather was nice. Watching the sun set over his land, Thomas had convinced himself that he was content with this life. He told himself that he didn't need complications or drama that other people seemed to bring with them. His animals depended on him, and he took pride in providing for them. The land was productive under his care, and that gave him a sense of purpose. What more could a man really need? But deep down, in a place he rarely let his thoughts wander, Thomas sometimes felt like he was waiting for something. He couldn't say what exactly, but there was a restlessness that would creep in during the quiet moments. It felt like standing at the edge of a river, knowing there was another side but never having the courage to cross over to see what was there. He had built a life that was safe and predictable, but it was also small and lonely. At 40 years old, Thomas had become a man who was afraid of his own shadow when it came to connecting with other people. He had forgotten how to make small talk or how to laugh at someone else's jokes. He had forgotten what it felt like to look forward to seeing another person or to miss someone when they were gone. The irony was that Thomas was actually a kind and gentle man underneath all that isolation. The way he cared for his animals showed a tenderness that most people never got to see. His patience with a sick calf or an injured chicken revealed a heart that was capable of great compassion. But he had wrapped that heart in so many layers of routine and solitude that it had become almost invisible, even to himself. This was the man who would soon find his carefully ordered world turned completely upside down by a storm, and the stranger's simple request for shelter. The weather had been strange all week. Thomas could feel it in his bones the way his father had taught him to read the signs. The air felt heavy and thick, like trying to breathe through wet cotton. The cows were restless, pacing in the pasture, instead of grazing peacefully. Even the old barn cat had been acting odd, hiding under the porch instead of prowling around the yard like usual. Thomas had been watching the western sky since breakfast, noting how the clouds were building up dark and angry-looking. The wind had started picking up around noon, making the tall grass in the far field dance and sway in ways that made him uneasy. He had lived on this land long enough to know when trouble was coming, and every instinct he had was telling him this wasn't going to be an ordinary storm. By 3 in the afternoon, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in just an hour. The wind was howling now, bending the old oak tree near the house at angles that made Thomas worry about its roots. He could see debris flying through the air, pieces of someone else's roof or fence posts that had been torn loose and were now tumbling across his property like deadly tumbleweeds. The first drops of rain started falling around 4 o'clock, but they weren't the gentle drops of a normal shower. These were fat, heavy drops that hit the ground with the force of small stones. Within minutes, those drops had turned into sheets of water that seemed to be falling sideways as much as down. Thomas had to squint just to see from the house to the barn, which was only 50 yards away. He pulled on his heaviest coat and his waterproof boots, knowing he had to get the animals secured before the worst of it hit. The chickens were already huddled in their coop, but he needed to make sure the door was latched tight. The 3 cows would need to be brought in from the pasture, and the old horse would have to be moved from the small paddock to the safety of the barn. Fighting against the wind, Thomas made his way across the yard. The rain was coming down so hard now that it stung his face like tiny needles. His boots squelched through mud that hadn't been there an hour ago. The familiar path to the barn felt treacherous and unfamiliar in the growing darkness of the storm. Clouds. The barn door was already straining against its hinges, and Thomas had to throw his full weight against it to get it open. Inside, the old building groaned and creaked as the wind tested every board and nail. He could hear loose metal. Somewhere above him, probably part of the roof that was starting to come free. The sound made his stomach clench with worry. This barn had stood for 60 years, but he had never seen a storm like this one. Getting the animals moved took longer than usual because they were all spooked by the noise and the strange energy in the air. The cows didn't want to leave the small shelter they had found under a cluster of trees, and it took all of Thomas's patience and skill to coax them toward the barn. The horse was easier, following Thomas's familiar voice and gentle hands, but even the usually calm animal was dancing nervously as they made their way through the driving rain. By the time he got all the animals safely inside, Thomas was soaked through to the skin despite his heavy coat. His hair was plastered to his head, and water was running down his neck in cold rivulets that made him shiver. He was just securing the last stall door when he heard something that made him freeze in. It was a voice, barely audible over the howling wind and driving rain. Human voice calling out somewhere near the front of his property. At first, he thought he might be imagining it. Who would be out in weather like this? But then he heard it again, clearer this time, and definitely real. Thomas rushed to the barn door and peered out into the storm. Through the sheets of rain, he could barely make out a figure near his front gate. Someone was standing there, completely exposed to the fury of the storm, and they appeared to be calling toward the house. Without thinking, Thomas ran through the rain toward the figure. As he got closer, he could see it was a woman, young and small, with long dark hair that was now completely soaked and clinging to her face and shoulders. She was wearing clothes that had probably been warm and dry when she started her journey, but now they hung on her like wet rags. She was shivering so hard that Thomas could see it even from several feet away. She was Native American, he could tell, with the kind of strong, beautiful features that spoke of heritage and pride. But right now, she just looked cold and scared, and desperately in need of help. When she saw him approaching, she tried to speak, but her teeth were chattering so hard that the words came out broken and unclear. Thomas had to lean close to hear her over the storm. She was asking if she could wait out the weather somewhere on his property, maybe in his barn or any outbuilding he might have. Her voice was soft and polite despite her obvious distress, and there was something in her eyes that reminded him of a wild animal that had been cornered but was still trying to maintain its dignity. For a moment, Thomas just stood there, rain streaming down his face, not sure what to do. He hadn't had an unexpected visitor in years, let alone someone asking to stay on his property. His first instinct was to invite her into the house, but something about that felt too forward, too intimate for a first meeting with a stranger. The barn, though, that felt safer somehow. More appropriate, he nodded toward the big building behind him and motioned for her to follow. She seemed to understand immediately and fell into step beside him as they fought their way back through the storm. Thomas found himself walking slower than usual, making sure she could keep up, and even though they didn't speak during the short journey, he was acutely aware of her presence beside him. Inside the barn, the sudden absence of wind and rain felt almost shocking. The building was still noisy with the storm raging outside, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the chaos they had just escaped. The woman stood just inside the door, dripping water onto the hay-covered floor, looking around. At the space with grateful eyes, Thomas realized he didn't even know her name, and she didn't know his. They were two complete strangers who had been thrown together by circumstances beyond their control. The old Thomas, the one who had lived alone for 15 years, would have been tongue-tied and awkward in this situation. But something about the storm, about the urgency of getting her to safety, had pushed past his usual social paralysis. He found his voice and asked if she was hurt, if she needed medical attention. She shook her head, managing a small smile that transformed her face despite her bedraggled appearance. She told him her name was Ayana, and she thanked him for his kindness in a voice that was warm and genuine even though she was still shivering from the cold. Thomas felt something shift inside his chest as he looked at this unexpected visitor who had appeared on his property like something out of a story. The storm was still raging outside, but for the first time in years he wasn't facing it alone. Thomas stood there in the barn, watching Ayana shiver in her soaked clothes, and felt completely out of his depth. He had spent 15 years avoiding situations exactly like this one. What was he supposed to do now? What did people say to strangers who showed up during storms? His mind raced through possibilities, but none of them felt right coming from someone who barely talked to the cashier at the grocery store. Ayana seemed to sense his discomfort. She wrapped her arms around herself and took a small step back, giving him space. Her voice was gentle when she spoke, telling him she didn't want to be any trouble, that she just needed somewhere dry to wait until the storm passed. She would be fine right here in the barn, she said, and she would leave as soon as the weather cleared up. Something about the way she said it, so polite and careful not to impose, made Thomas's chest tighten. She was trying to make herself as small and undemanding as possible, and it reminded him of the way injured animals would sometimes curl up and try to hide their pain. Without really thinking about it, he found himself shaking his head and mumbling that she couldn't stay out here in wet clothes, that she would catch her death of cold. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. Here he was, the man who never invited anyone into his house, suggesting that a complete stranger come inside. But looking at her standing there dripping wet and trying not to shiver too obviously, it seemed like the only decent thing to do. Ayana hesitated, clearly not wanting to push her luck. She glanced around the barn, taking in the clean stalls and the neat stacks of hay bales, and suggested that she would be comfortable enough here. She had slept in worse places, she said with a small smile that didn't quite hide the tiredness. In her eyes, Thomas felt something stir in him that he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was protectiveness, he realized, the same feeling he got when one of his animals was hurt or scared. But this was different somehow, stronger and more complicated. He cleared his throat and told her about the old blankets he kept in the barn for the animals, and how he could bring her some food from the house. As he rummaged through the storage area looking for the cleanest blankets he could find, Thomas kept glancing over at Ayana. She had moved closer to the animals, and he was amazed to see how naturally they responded to her. The old horse had come to the stall door and was letting her stroke his nose, something he rarely allowed strangers to do. Even the cows seemed calmer with her presence. He found a wool blanket that his mother had used for sick calves, one that was worn but clean and warm. When he brought it to her, their hands brushed briefly as she took it from him. Her skin was cold as ice, but her touch sent an unexpected warmth shooting up his arm. He pulled his hand back quickly, unsure what to make of the sensation. Ayana wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and immediately looked more comfortable. She thanked him with such genuine gratitude that Thomas felt his cheeks grow warm. He wasn't used to being thanked for anything, especially not in that tone of voice that made him feel like he had done something truly meaningful. The storm was getting worse outside, and Thomas knew he needed to check on the rest of his property. But he found himself reluctant to leave the barn, reluctant to break this strange new feeling of having someone else to worry about. He told Ayana he would be back soon with some food, and she nodded, settling down on a hay bale and pulling the blanket tighter around herself. Walking back to the house through the driving rain, Thomas felt like he was moving through a dream. The familiar path seemed different somehow, charged with new possibility. Inside his kitchen, he stood dripping on the linoleum floor and tried to figure out what kind of food to bring to a stranger sheltering in his barn. He made coffee first, strong and black the way he liked it, then remembered that she might prefer cream or sugar. He had both, though he never used them himself. He found an old thermos that had belonged to his father and filled it with the hot coffee, then added a small container of cream and some sugar packets he had saved from restaurants. For food, he settled on making sandwiches. Ham and cheese on thick slices of the bread he had baked earlier in the week. He wrapped them carefully in clean dish towels and added some of his mother's homemade pickles from the jar in the refrigerator. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling and warm, the kind of food that would help chase away the chill from being caught in a storm. He changed into dry clothes before heading back out, putting on his warmest jacket and grabbing an extra one that might fit Ayana. It had belonged to his mother, and he hadn't looked at it in years. But tonight it seemed right to bring it along. The trip back to the barn felt like the longest 50 yards of his life. Thomas found himself nervous in a way he hadn't been since. He was a teenager asking someone to dance at the church social. What if she had changed her mind about staying? What if she had decided to brave the storm rather than accept help from a strange man? What if he said something wrong and scared her away? But when he pushed open the barn door, she was still there, sitting on the hay bale with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She had removed her wet shoes and was flexing her toes to warm them up. The sight of those small, bare feet made Thomas feel strangely protective again. Ayana's face lit up when she saw the thermos and the bundle of food he carried. She accepted them gratefully, her cold hands wrapping around the warm thermos like it was precious treasure. When she tasted the coffee, she closed her eyes for a moment and sighed with pleasure, telling him it was exactly what she needed. Thomas found himself lingering as she unwrapped the sandwiches. He had intended to just drop off the food and leave her to rest, but something about watching her eat food he had prepared with his own hands kept him rooted in place. When was the last time he had cooked for someone else? When was the last time someone had appreciated something he had made? They began to talk hesitantly at first. Ayana told him she was traveling to the next county looking for work, that she had been caught by the storm while walking along the main road. Thomas found himself asking questions, something he rarely did with the few people he encountered. Where was she from? What kind of work was she looking for? Did she have family waiting for her? Her answers came slowly, but Thomas sensed she was being honest with him. She spoke about her family with love, but also with a kind of sadness that made him think there were complicated stories there. She talked about needing to find her own way in the world, about wanting to earn her own living rather than depending on others. As she talked, Thomas realized he was having the longest conversation he had experienced in years. More surprising still, it didn't feel awkward or forced. Something about the storm outside and the quiet warmth of the barn made talking feel natural and safe. Ayana had a way of listening that made him feel like his words mattered, like she was truly interested in what he had to say. When she asked him about the farm, about how long he had lived here, Thomas found himself telling her things he had never spoken aloud to anyone. About how lonely it got during the long winter evenings, about how sometimes he would go days without hearing his own voice except to talk to the animals, about how he had never learned to be comfortable around people the way other folks seemed to be. Ayana listened without judgment, nodding at the right moments and asking gentle questions that showed she understood more than he was saying. When he finished talking, she was quiet for a long moment, then told him softly that solitude wasn't always a bad thing, that some people needed quiet to hear their own thoughts clearly. The storm raged on outside, but inside the barn, something fragile and precious was beginning to grow between two people who had been strangers just hours before. The storm didn't let up that first night, and by morning it was clear this wasn't going to be over quickly. Thomas woke to the sound of rain still hammering against his bedroom window and wind that seemed even stronger than the day before. Tree branches were scattered across his yard, and he could see that part of his chicken coop's roof had blown away during the night. His first thought was of Ayana in the barn. Had she been warm enough? Had the roof held up against the wind? He dressed quickly and hurried outside, fighting against gusts that nearly knocked him sideways. When he reached the barn, he called out before entering, not wanting to startle her. She was awake, sitting on the same hay bale where he had left her the night before, but she had made herself more comfortable. She had spread the blanket out like a small bed and had arranged her wet clothes on a makeshift clothesline using baling wire. Her long dark hair was braided now, keeping it neat and out of her face. Ayana smiled when she saw him, a real smile that reached her eyes and made Thomas feel warm despite the cold morning air. She told him she had slept better than she had in weeks, that the sound of the animals moving around had been comforting somehow. She asked if his house was okay, if the storm had caused any damage he needed to deal with. Thomas was struck by her thoughtfulness. Here she was, a stranger who had taken shelter in his barn, and she was asking about his welfare. It had been so long since anyone had shown concern for him that he almost didn't know how to respond. He told her about the chicken coop roof and mentioned that he would need to check the rest of the property once the wind died down. Without hesitation, Ayana offered to help. She said she had grown up around farms and knew her way around tools and repair work. Thomas started to protest, saying he couldn't ask a guest to work, but she laughed and pointed out that she wasn't exactly a guest in the traditional sense. She was more like a refugee from the storm, she said, and refugees should earn their keep. The way she said it with humor, but also with genuine desire to be useful, made something shift in Thomas's chest. He realized she wasn't offering to help, out of politeness or obligation. She actually wanted to be part of solving the problem, wanted to contribute something meaningful rather than just accept his charity. He brought her breakfast from the house, scrambled eggs and thick slices of bacon with toast and butter. This time he stayed longer, sitting on an overturned bucket while she ate. The conversation came easier today, without the urgency and strangeness of the night before. They talked about practical things at first, the kind of repairs the storm damage would require, the best way to secure loose roofing, but gradually their talk began to drift to deeper waters. Ayanna asked him about his parents, whether he missed them, what it had been like to suddenly find himself alone on the farm. Thomas found himself telling her things he had never put into words before. How guilty he had felt for not missing them. More in the day-to-day routine of keeping the farm running. How sometimes he would catch himself listening for his mother's voice calling him in for dinner. Even after all these years, Ayanna listened with a kind of attention that Thomas had never experienced before. She didn't just wait for her turn to talk or offer quick solutions to make him feel better. She seemed to understand that some feelings needed to be spoken aloud and witnessed, not fixed or explained away. When he finished talking about his parents, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she began to share her own story. She told him about growing up on the reservation, about a childhood filled with extended family and community, gatherings and a deep connection to traditions that went back generations. But she also spoke about the struggles, the lack of opportunities, the way young people had to choose between staying with family and venturing out into a world that didn't always welcome them. Her voice grew softer when she talked about her decision to leave. It hadn't been easy, she said. Her grandmother had wanted her to stay, to marry a young man from their community and raise children who would carry on the old ways. But Ayanna had felt called to something different, something she couldn't quite name but knew she had to pursue. Thomas found himself leaning forward as she spoke, drawn in by the quiet intensity in her voice. She talked about the land in a way that resonated deep in his bones. She spoke of feeling connected to the earth beneath her feet, of understanding the rhythms of seasons and weather in a way that went beyond just knowing when to plant and harvest. As she described her people's relationship with the natural world, Thomas began to see his own farm through different eyes. He had always loved this land, but he had thought of it mainly in terms of productivity and survival. Ayanna helped him understand that there could be a spiritual dimension to farming, a sense of partnership with the earth rather than just using it. The second day of the storm brought hail that drummed against the barn roof like thousands of tiny hammers. Thomas and Ayanna spent most of that day in deep conversation, sharing stories and perspectives that neither of them had ever voiced to another person. She told him about the healing properties of plants, knowledge passed down through generations of her people. He shared his observations about animal behavior, the subtle signs that told him when a cow was getting sick or when the weather was about to change. They discovered they both loved to read, though their choices were very different. Thomas preferred practical books about farming and history, while Ayanna was drawn to poetry and stories about people from different cultures. But they found common ground in their love of learning, their curiosity about the world beyond their immediate experience. On the third day, when the storm finally began to weaken, Thomas realized he was dreading the moment when Ayanna would decide it was safe to continue her journey. The barn had become a sanctuary, not just from the weather, but from the loneliness that had defined his life for so many years. Their conversations had awakened something in him that he hadn't even known was sleeping. Ayanna seemed to sense his reluctance to see her go. When she mentioned that she should probably start thinking about moving on, her voice lacked the enthusiasm of someone eager to get back on the road. She had found something here too, Thomas realized. Something she had been searching for without knowing exactly what it was. They began to talk about her plans, about the work she hoped to find and the life she wanted to build for herself. Thomas found himself asking questions that surprised him, practical questions about where she would stay and how she would manage on her own. Part of him wanted to help, wanted to be involved in solving her problems, but he didn't know how to express that without overstepping bounds. He wasn't even sure he understood. As the third evening approached and the storm finally began to move on, both of them seemed to be searching for ways to extend their time together. Thomas lingered longer each time he brought food from the house. Ayanna asked more questions about the farm, about his daily routines, about his plans for the coming season. Neither of them said it directly, but something profound had happened during those 3 days in the barn. Two people who had been strangers had found in each other a kind of understanding and connection that neither had experienced before. Thomas had discovered that he wasn't as hopeless at human connection as he had believed. Ayanna had found someone who listened to her dreams without judgment and who shared her deep love for the land. The storm had brought them together, but it was their willingness to be vulnerable with each other, to share their true selves despite the risk, that had created something beautiful and unexpected between them. As they sat together in the quiet barn, listening to the wind finally begin to calm, both of them knew that their lives had been changed forever. When Thomas woke up on the fourth morning, the first thing he noticed was the silence. After 3 days of constant wind and rain, the sudden quiet felt almost unnatural. Pale sunlight was streaming through his bedroom window, and when he looked outside, he could see blue sky peeking through the breaking clouds. The storm had finally passed. His second thought was that Ayanna would probably want to leave today. The realization hit him like a physical blow, leaving him standing by his window with an ache in his chest that he didn't quite know how to handle. For 3 days, he had had someone to talk to, someone who listened to his thoughts and shared her own. Now that companionship was about to disappear, leaving him alone again in his quiet farmhouse. He dressed slowly, putting off the moment when he would have to walk out to the barn and begin what felt like a goodbye. But eventually there was no avoiding it. He made coffee and prepared breakfast for two, telling himself it might be the last time he would have reason to cook for someone else. When he reached the barn, Ayanna was already awake and had gathered her now dry clothes. She was standing by the open door, looking out at the damage the storm had left behind. Fallen tree branches lay scattered across the yard, and puddles reflected the morning sky like broken mirrors. The air smelled clean and fresh, washed by 3 days of rain. She turned when she heard him approach, and Thomas was struck again by how beautiful she was. Without the desperation of seeking shelter from a storm, without wet hair plastered to her face, she looked composed and confident. But there was something in her eyes that seemed reluctant, as if she too was having second thoughts about moving on. They ate breakfast together in companionable silence, both of them seeming to understand that this meal felt different from the others they had shared. Thomas found himself paying attention to small details, the way she wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup, the careful way she folded the napkin when she was finished eating. He was storing up memories, he realized, trying to capture moments he could replay later when she was gone. After breakfast, Ayanna surprised him by asking if she could help clean up the storm damage before she left. It seemed like the least she could do, she said, after he had been so kind to her. Thomas wanted to protest that she didn't owe him anything, but the truth was he wasn't ready to see her go. If helping with cleanup gave them a few more hours together, he wasn't going to argue. Working side by side in the bright morning sun felt completely different from their conversations in the dim barn. Out here, Thomas could see how naturally Ayanna moved around the farm, how she seemed to understand what needed to be done without being told. She helped him drag fallen branches to a pile for burning later, and she proved surprisingly strong for someone so small, lifting and carrying loads that impressed him. As they worked, they talked about practical things, but underneath the surface conversation, Thomas sensed they were both dancing around something more important. When Ayanna mentioned that she should probably get back on the road by afternoon, neither of them seemed enthusiastic about the idea. When Thomas suggested they take a break for lunch, they both jumped at the excuse to stop working and spend more time talking over sandwiches on the front porch. Their conversation turned to more personal territory. Ayanna asked Thomas about his dreams, whether he had ever wanted to do anything besides farm. The question caught him off guard because no one had ever asked him about dreams before. People asked about crop yields and livestock prices, but never about the longings he kept hidden in his heart. He found himself telling her about his secret wish to travel, to see some of the places he had read about in his mother's books. He had always been curious about mountains and oceans, about cities where people from all over the world came together. But he had also always felt tied to this land, responsible for keeping it going, afraid that if he left even for a short time, something terrible would happen. Ayanna listened with the same careful attention she had given all his words over the past few days. When he finished talking, she was quiet for a moment, then told him something that surprised him. She said she could see him as a traveler, that there was a curiosity in his eyes that suggested he had more adventurous spirit than he gave himself credit for. The key, she said, was learning to trust that the land would still be here when he got back. Her words stirred something deep inside Thomas, a longing he had buried so completely he had almost forgotten it existed. But more than that, the fact that she could see possibilities in him that he couldn't see in himself made him feel understood in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. As the afternoon wore on, they found excuse after excuse to delay her departure. There was more storm debris to clear. The chicken coop roof needed temporary repairs. The animals seemed restless and might benefit from her calming presence for a little longer. Each task led to another, and Thomas began to hope that maybe, just maybe, she was as reluctant to leave as he was to see her go. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, they could no longer pretend there was urgent work to be done. They stood together in the farmyard, both of them knowing the moment of decision had arrived. Ayanna's small bundle of belongings sat by the gate, ready for her to pick up and continue her journey to wherever the road might lead her. But instead of reaching for her things, Ayanna turned to Thomas with an expression he couldn't quite read. She thanked him again for his kindness, but her voice lacked the finality of someone actually saying goodbye. She seemed to be waiting for something, though Thomas couldn't figure out what. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the things they weren't saying. Thomas felt words building up in his chest, important words that might change everything if he could just find the courage to speak them. He wanted to tell her that these past few days had been the best he could remember in years. He wanted to ask if she had felt the same connection he had felt, the same sense of rightness when they talked and worked together. But the old Thomas, the one who had spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of emotional risk, kept the words locked inside. What if she didn't feel the same way? What if she was just being polite to someone who had helped her during a difficult time? What if he misunderstood everything and made a fool of himself? Ayanna seemed to sense his internal struggle. She took a step closer to him, close enough that he could smell the clean scent of her hair and see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. She told him softly that she had never met anyone quite like him, someone who listened so carefully and thought so deeply about things most people took for granted. Her words gave Thomas the courage he needed. Before he could lose his nerve, he heard himself asking if she might consider staying a little longer. Not permanently, he said quickly, not wanting to scare her with too much too soon. But maybe just for a few more days to help him finish repairing the storm damage. He could pay her for the work, he added, trying to make it sound like a practical business arrangement rather than a desperate plea from a lonely man who had found something precious and couldn't bear to lose it. Ayanna's face lit up with a smile. That told Thomas everything he needed to know. She had been hoping he would ask. She had been looking for a reason to stay just as hard as he had been looking for a reason to ask her to. The connection between them wasn't one-sided after all. It was real and mutual and worth exploring, no matter how scary that might be for two people who had both learned to protect their hearts carefully. As they stood there in the golden light of early evening, both of them smiling with relief and anticipation, Thomas realized his life was about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine. The storm had brought Ayanna to his door, but it was their choice to trust each other, to take the risk of letting someone else matter that would determine what happened next. The first week after Ayanna agreed to stay was the strangest and most wonderful week of Thomas's life. He had lived alone for so long that having another person around felt like learning to breathe differently. Everything about his daily routine, had to change, and he found himself both excited and terrified by each small adjustment. The biggest challenge was figuring out the living arrangements. Thomas spent an entire evening cleaning out the small spare room that had become a storage space for old farming equipment and his mother's sewing supplies. He had never thought much about how the room looked before, but now he found himself seeing it through Ayana's eyes, worrying that it was too small or too plain or too far from the bathroom when he showed her the room, apologizing for its simplicity. Ayana surprised him by saying it was perfect. She loved the window that looked out over the back pasture, and she appreciated that it was far enough from his bedroom to give them both privacy while they figured out this new arrangement. Her response made Thomas realize he had been overthinking everything, a habit that would take time to break. The first morning Ayana woke up in the house, Thomas was already dressed and making coffee when he heard her moving around upstairs. He had been awake since 4:30, too nervous and excited to sleep, wondering what it would be like to share breakfast with someone every day. When she came down to the kitchen, her hair braided loosely and her feet bare on the cold linoleum, Thomas felt his heart skip in a way that made him feel like a teenager again. They were both awkward at first, careful and polite in the way of people who are attracted to each other but don't know the rules yet. Thomas would catch himself staring at the way the morning light caught in Ayana's hair, then look away quickly when she noticed. Ayana would start to reach for something at the same time Thomas did, and they would bump hands and apologize and laugh nervously, but the work gave them something to focus on besides their growing awareness of each other. There was plenty to do after the storm, and Ayana proved to be every bit as capable as she had claimed. She could handle tools with confidence, and she had an intuitive understanding of how things worked that impressed Thomas more each day. Together, they repaired the chicken coop roof, replacing the torn shingles with new ones Thomas ordered from the hardware store in town. Ayana worked alongside him on the ladder, handing him nails and holding boards steady, and Thomas found himself marveling at how natural it felt to have a partner in the work. For 15 years, every repair job had been a solitary struggle, but with Ayana helping, even the difficult tasks felt manageable and somehow enjoyable. The trip to town for supplies was an adventure in itself. Thomas hadn't taken a passenger in his truck for years, and he found himself hyper-aware of Ayana sitting beside him, the way she looked out the windows with interest at the countryside they passed. When they reached the hardware store, he noticed how people looked at them, curious about the stranger he had brought with him. Old Mr. Patterson, who owned the store, couldn't hide his surprise at seeing Thomas with a companion. He kept glancing between them while he rang up the shingles and nails, clearly bursting with questions he was too polite to ask directly. Thomas found himself standing a little straighter, feeling proud to be seen with someone as graceful and intelligent as Ayana. The return trip home felt different than the journey into town. They talked more easily, and Thomas found himself pointing out landmarks and telling stories about the area that he had never shared with anyone before. Ayana listened with genuine interest, asking questions about the history of the land and the families who had farmed it over the years. Back at the farm, their working rhythm improved each day. Ayana had a way of anticipating what Thomas needed before he asked for it, and she brought fresh perspectives to problems he had been solving the same way for years. When they worked on fencing repairs, she suggested using a different knot that her grandfather had taught her, one that was stronger and more flexible than the method Thomas had always used. Evenings were the most challenging time as they tried to navigate the transition from working partners to whatever they were becoming. Personally, they would sit together on the front porch after dinner, watching the sun set over the fields, both of them acutely aware of the space between them on the old wooden bench. Their conversations during these evening hours grew deeper and more personal. Ayana told Thomas about her dreams of someday having a place of her own, somewhere she could grow healing plants and maybe teach other young women the traditional knowledge her grandmother had passed down to her. Thomas shared his secret fear that he wasn't really cut out for the solitary life he had chosen, that maybe he had been hiding from the world rather than choosing independence. One evening, about 10 days after she had moved into the house, they were sitting closer together than usual when Ayana reached over and touched Thomas's hand. It was a simple gesture, her fingers brushing over his calloused knuckles, but it sent electricity shooting through his entire body. He turned his hand palm up, and she interlaced her fingers with his, and they sat there holding hands like teenagers, both of them hardly daring to breathe. That night, Thomas lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. He could still feel the warmth of her hand in his, still remember the way her eyes had looked in the fading light when she smiled at him. He was falling in love, he realized, probably had been since that first night in the barn, but now it was becoming impossible to deny or ignore. The next morning brought the first real test of their new arrangement. Thomas woke up feeling sick, something he almost never experienced. His head was pounding, and his stomach felt queasy in a way that made him worry he might have picked up some kind of flu bug. He tried to get up and start his usual routine, but the room spun around him, forcing him back down onto the bed. When he didn't appear for coffee at his usual time, Ayanna came looking for him. She found him trying to get dressed despite feeling terrible, determined not to let his weakness interfere with the work that needed to be done. But Ayanna wouldn't hear of it. She ordered him back to bed with a firmness that surprised them both, then took over his morning chores without being asked. From his bedroom window, Thomas watched her move confidently around the farmyard, feeding the chickens and checking on the cows with the competence of someone who had grown up around animals. She seemed to know instinctively what each task required, and the animals responded to her with the same trust they had always shown Thomas. When she brought him soup and hot tea later that morning, Thomas felt overwhelmed by her kindness. No one had taken care of him when he was sick since his mother died, and he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone worry about his well-being. Ayanna sat on the edge of his bed while he ate, her hand cool against his fevered forehead, and Thomas realized that this was what partnership really meant. It wasn't just about sharing work and conversation. It was about caring for each other through weakness as well as strength. By evening, Thomas was feeling much better, but the day had changed something fundamental between them. Ayanna had proven that she could handle the farm responsibilities on her own when needed, and Thomas had learned that accepting help didn't make him weak or dependent. They had taken another step toward becoming true partners, people who could rely on each other completely. That night, as they sat together on the porch again, the space between them seemed smaller than it had before. When Ayanna leaned against Thomas's shoulder, he wrapped his arm around her naturally, as if they had been sitting this way for years. The gesture felt right and comfortable and full of promise for all the evenings yet to come. Spring arrived earlier than usual that year, bringing with it a sense of new beginnings that seemed to mirror the changes happening in Thomas's heart. The snow melted quickly, revealing green shoots of grass pushing up through the dark earth, and the trees began to bud with the promise of warmer days ahead. Thomas had lived through 39 springs on this farm, but this one felt completely different because he wasn't experiencing it alone. Ayanna had been living in the farmhouse for almost 3 months now, and their daily rhythm had settled into something comfortable and natural. They worked together during the day, shared meals and conversation in the evenings, and slowly, carefully, allowed themselves to grow closer in ways that felt both thrilling and terrifying to Thomas. The first time Ayanna kissed him, it was completely unexpected. They had been working in the garden, preparing the soil for the spring planting, when Thomas made a joke about something silly and she laughed in a way that lit up her entire face. Without thinking, she leaned over and kissed his cheek, a quick, spontaneous gesture that left them both frozen in surprise. Thomas touched his cheek where her lips had been, his heart racing so fast he thought she might be able to hear it. Ayanna's face flushed pink and she started to apologize, but Thomas stopped her by taking her dirt-covered hand in his and telling her, softly, that she didn't need to be sorry for anything that felt so right. From that moment on, small displays of affection became part of their daily life. A touch on the shoulder when passing in the kitchen, fingers brushing when they handed tools to each other. The way Ayanna would rest her hand on Thomas's back when she stood behind his chair at dinner. Each gesture was gentle and careful, as if they were both learning a new language together, but for Thomas, learning to love meant more than just physical affection. It meant opening up parts of himself that he had kept locked away for so long that he had almost forgotten they existed. Ayana had a way of asking questions that made him think about things differently, and she listened to his answers with such genuine interest that he found himself sharing thoughts and feelings he had never spoken aloud. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, Ayana asked Thomas about his fears. Not the practical ones like bad weather or sick animals, but the deeper fears that kept him awake sometimes in the middle of the night. The question caught him off guard, and his first instinct was to give her a safe, surface-level answer. But something about the way she was looking at him, patient and accepting, made him decide to risk the truth. He told her about his fear of not being enough, of disappointing people who mattered to him. He talked about how he had always felt like he was missing some essential knowledge about how to connect with other people, like there was a manual for human relationships that everyone else had received, but him. Ayana was quiet for a long time after he finished talking. Then she told him something that changed the way he saw himself forever. She said that his gentleness was not a weakness but a strength, that the way he cared for his animals and his land showed a capacity for love that many people never developed. The fact that he was careful with his heart, she said, didn't mean he didn't know how to love. It meant that when he chose to love someone, it would mean something profound and lasting. Her words unlocked something in Thomas that had been bound up tight for years. He began to see that his years of solitude hadn't been wasted time or evidence of his inadequacy. They had been preparation, a slow process of learning to be at peace with himself so that he could eventually share that peace with someone else. As spring turned toward summer, their physical relationship deepened with the same careful tenderness that marked everything else between them. The first time Thomas kissed Ayana properly was on a warm June evening when they had been sitting on the porch talking about their dreams for the future. She had been telling him about her hope to someday teach young women about the healing properties of plants, and the passion in her voice as she spoke made her even more beautiful to him. When she finished talking, Thomas found the courage to tell her that listening to her dreams made him want to dream bigger too. He said that before she came, he had thought his life was complete, but now he realized he had only been existing, not really living. The way she looked at him when he said those words with such warmth and understanding made him lean forward and kiss her with all the love and longing he had been holding back. The kiss was everything Thomas had imagined and more, soft and sweet and filled with promise. When they pulled apart, Ayana smiled at him with such happiness that he felt like he could do anything, be anything, as long as she kept looking at him that way. Learning to express his feelings physically was just as much of a journey for Thomas as learning to express them with words. He had to overcome years of believing that he was awkward and undesirable, years of thinking that he didn't deserve the kind of love he saw other people sharing. But Ayana's patient encouragement and obvious affection for him gradually wore down those old insecurities. She taught him that love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect words. It was about paying attention to small things like remembering how she liked her coffee or noticing when she was tired after a long day. It was about the way he would automatically hand her his jacket when the evening air grew cool, or how she would save him the last piece of cornbread because she knew it was his favorite. The cultural differences between them, which Thomas had worried might be a problem, turned out to be one of the richest parts of their relationship. Ayana taught him about her people's connection to the land, sharing knowledge about which plants could heal and which ones could harm. She showed him how to read the sky for weather patterns in ways his father had never taught him, and she introduced him to stories and traditions that gave new meaning to the cycles of planting and harvest he had followed all his life. In return, Thomas shared the history of his family's time on this land, the generations of careful stewardship that had kept the soil fertile and the water clean. He taught Ayana the specific quirks of his animals, how to tell when the old cow was feeling arthritic or when the horses were restless because of an approaching storm. Together, they created new traditions that honored both of their backgrounds. They began each planting season with a small ceremony that combined Thomas's practical prayers for good weather with Ayana's traditional blessings for the earth. They learned to cook dishes that blended her family's recipes with his, creating meals that tasted like home to both of them. The most profound change in Thomas was the way he began to see himself through Ayana's eyes. Where he had always seen awkwardness, she saw thoughtfulness. Where he had seen weakness, she saw sensitivity. Where he had seen failure to connect with people, she saw a man who loved so deeply and carefully that his affection, once given, would never waver. By midsummer, Thomas realized that he was no longer the same man who had lived alone on this farm for 15 years. Ayana's love had awakened parts of him that he hadn't known existed, but more than that, it had given him the courage to become the man he had always had the potential to be. He was still quiet and thoughtful, still more comfortable with animals than with crowds of people, but he was no longer afraid of his own heart or ashamed of his gentle nature. As they worked together in the garden one warm July evening, Thomas watched Ayana examining tomato plants with the focused attention she brought to everything she cared about, and he knew with absolute certainty that he wanted to spend the rest of his life learning to love her better each day. The first autumn storm of the year arrived exactly 1 year after the night Thomas and Ayana had first met. As thunder rolled across the sky and rain began to drum against the farmhouse windows, they both found themselves remembering that wild October evening when a desperate stranger had knocked on a lonely man's heart and changed everything. But this time, they watched the storm from inside the warm kitchen, Thomas's arms wrapped around Ayana as she leaned back against his chest. The fear and uncertainty of that first night seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by a deep contentment that neither of them had ever imagined possible. The past year had transformed not just their relationship, but the entire farm. What had once been a place of solitude had become a thriving home full of life and laughter. Ayana's herb garden flourished beside the house, filled with plants she used for cooking and healing. The vegetable garden had doubled in size, and they had added flower beds that attracted butterflies and bees. Even the animals seemed happier, responding to the harmony between their caretakers. Thomas had proposed to Ayana on a warm summer evening in July, but not in any way that either of them had expected. They had been working late in the barn, helping a cow through a difficult birth, when the calf finally arrived healthy and strong. As they sat together on a hay bale, exhausted but triumphant, watching the mother clean her newborn, Thomas had suddenly turned to Ayana and said that this was what he wanted for the rest of his life. Not just the farming, but this feeling of working together toward something meaningful, of celebrating life's victories with someone who understood their true value. When Ayana asked him what exactly he was saying, Thomas took her dirt-covered hands in his and told her simply that he loved her and wanted to marry her if she would have him. There were no fancy words or elaborate plans, just the honest truth spoken in a barn surrounded by the animals they both cared for. Ayana's answer was a kiss that tasted of joy and tears and the promise of all the tomorrows they would share. Their wedding had been small and perfect, held right there on the farm on a crisp September day when the maple trees were dressed in their finest gold and red. Ayana had worn a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, with traditional beadwork around the neckline that her grandmother had made for her mother's wedding years before. Thomas had worn his father's best suit, altered to fit him properly, and had never felt more handsome or more nervous in his life. The ceremony had been performed by the circuit preacher who served several of the rural churches in the area, but they had incorporated elements from both of their traditions. Ayana's uncle had driven down from the reservation to perform a blessing that honored their connection to the land, while Thomas's neighbors had gathered to witness their vows in the Christian tradition. He had grown up with Mrs. Henderson had cried openly during the ceremony, telling anyone who would listen that she had never seen Thomas look so happy. Old Mr. Patterson from the hardware store had brought his fiddle and played music for dancing afterward, and even some of the more reserved neighbors had loosened up enough to join the celebration. But the most meaningful moment for Thomas had come when they exchanged their personal vows. Standing in front of everyone he knew, looking into Ayana's eyes, he had promised to love her gently and faithfully, to listen to her dreams and support her in pursuing them, and to never take for granted the miracle of having found each other. His voice had shaken with emotion, but the words had come from the deepest place in his heart. Ayana had promised to stand beside him through all of life's seasons, to share his love for the land while bringing her own wisdom to their partnership, and to help him remember always that his gentle heart was his greatest strength, not a weakness to be hidden. When she spoke about how he had given her not just love but a true home, Thomas had to blink back tears of gratitude. Now, as they listened to the anniversary storm rage outside their kitchen windows, Thomas marveled at how much his life had changed. The man who had once eaten his meals standing up at the counter now lingered over breakfast with his wife, talking about their plans for the day and sharing the small observations that made ordinary moments feel special. The house itself reflected their partnership. Ayana's touches were everywhere, from the colorful quilts she had made for their bed to the clay pots filled with herbs that lined the kitchen windowsills. But she had also honored the history of the place, carefully preserving his mother's china and displaying his father's farming tools in a place of respect. The result was a home that felt both completely new and comfortingly familiar. Their daily routines had evolved to make use of both their strengths. Thomas still handled most of the heavy farm work and managed the livestock, but Ayana had taken over the vegetable garden and had started a small business selling herbs and healing salves at the farmer's market in town. Her gentle nature with people had also helped Thomas become more comfortable with their neighbors, leading to friendships he never could have imagined in his solitary days. The most surprising change was how much Thomas had grown to enjoy having visitors. Ayana's family came to stay every few months, bringing laughter and stories that filled the house with warmth. Her grandmother, a tiny woman with eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul, had taken an immediate liking to Thomas, telling Ayana that she could see he had a farmer's heart and a good man's spirit. Thomas's relationships with his neighbors had deepened too. The Hendersons now stopped by regularly for coffee and conversation, and their children loved visiting the farm to see the new calves and help with simple chores. Thomas discovered that he actually enjoyed teaching the young ones about farm life, finding that his natural patience made him a good instructor. Even his relationship with the townspeople had improved. Where once he had been seen as the odd hermit who rarely spoke to anyone, he was now known as half of the couple who ran the best herb farm in 3 counties. People sought out Ayana's remedies for everything from headaches to sleepless nights, and they always left with kind words about how happy Thomas seemed these days. But perhaps the most profound change was in Thomas himself. The fearful, isolated man who had once hidden from the world had been replaced by someone who still valued quiet and solitude, but no longer mistook loneliness for peace. He had learned that sharing his life with someone who truly understood him didn't make him weaker or more vulnerable. Instead, it had given him strength he never knew he possessed. As the storm outside began to calm and the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, Thomas and Ayana made their way upstairs to their bedroom. In a few hours they would need to check for storm damage and begin the work of cleaning up whatever debris the wind had scattered across their property. But for now, they could simply hold each other and listen to the rain growing softer against their windows. Lying in bed, with his wife's head on his shoulder, Thomas thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he had been a man who thought his story was already written, that he was destined to live and die alone on this land his family had worked for generations. But love had rewritten everything, showing him that the best chapters of his life were just beginning. Ayana stirred in his arms, mumbling something about how peaceful the storm sounded now that they were safe inside together. Thomas kissed the top of her head and whispered that he loved her, and even though she was already drifting back to sleep, she squeezed his hand in response. As Thomas finally closed his eyes, he realized that he no longer felt like he was waiting for something to happen. His life was happening right now, right here, in the shared breath and shared dreams of the woman beside him. The innocent man who had opened his barn door to a stranger during a storm had found everything he never knew he was looking for, and tomorrow would bring new chances to love and be loved in return.